Order, order. We now move on to the next debate, which is government policy on school transport. Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be leading today's debate under your chairmanship. I'm sure that the Minister was not entirely surprised after my question to him on this subject in November to find my name against this topic. And I'm very pleased, however, that he is here to answer this afternoon's debate. If it is true that all politics is local, then nowhere does that seem to be more true than in relation to the vexed issue of home-to-school transport. My interest in the area of school transport policy arises as a result of a decision taken by Leicestershire County Council about the provision of a bus service to take pupils from the village of Salby to Humphrey Perkins School in Barrow-upon-Soar in my constituency. A smaller number of families in Mount Sorrel are also affected, but I will particularly focus on the Salby issue today. And the real objection in my case arises from the view of the Council that the proposed walking route from Salby to Barrow is safe, and the strongly held view of almost everyone else that it is not. But before I dwell on local matters, I feel duty-bound to explore why I believe the Minister and the Department for Education have an interest in this subject, despite the fact that decisions about the provision of home-to-school transport, the assessment of walking routes, and the decisions on appeals made by affected families are all matters for local authorities. I firmly believe in localism and that decisions about school transport routes should be made by local authorities and elected local members as long as they are made fairly and transparently. As I understand this area of policy, the duties and powers of local authorities in England to provide home-to-school transport are governed by national legislation, namely the Education Act 1996 as amended. In addition to the legislation, there has been case law on school transport, and detailed guidance on the provision of school transport is contained in Home-to-School Travel and Transport Guidance, published by the then Department for Education and Skills in 2007. Further, in March 2011, the Department for Education commissioned a review of the efficiency and practice in the procurement, planning and provision of school transport across England. Section 509 of the 1996 Act basically states that a local education authority shall make such arrangements for the provision of transport and otherwise as they consider necessary, or as the Secretary of State may direct, for the purpose of facilitating the attendance of persons not of sixth form age receiving education at schools. The 1986 case of Rogers and Essex County Council was one of the most significant cases brought in recent years on the issue of an available walking route. In its ruling, the House of Lords stated that for a route to be available within the meaning of the 1996 Act, it must be a route, and I quote, along which a child accompanied as necessary can walk and walk with reasonable safety to school. It does not fail to qualify as available because of dangers that would arise if the child remained unaccompanied, but the court also held that a route will be available even if the child would need to be accompanied along the route, as long as it is reasonably practicable for the child to be accompanied. Local education authorities may therefore take into account parents' capacity to accompany their child. Following this judgment, the law at that time was changed so that in considering whether or not they are required to make arrangements in relation to a particular pupil, a local education authority shall have regard, amongst other things, to the age of the pupil and the nature of the route or alternative routes which he could reasonably be expected to take. In the 1988 case, George and Devon County Council, I'm afraid this is showing my background as a lawyer here, so you'll have to forgive me for this, but I thought it was helpful to set that background. The High Court took the view that for an ordinary child whose home is within walking distance, but who applies under the relevant section, a local education authority should consider the age of the child and the nature of the route which he could reasonably be expected to take. The question, should the child be accompanied on the route or alternative route? If the answer is no, then normally there's no case for free transport. If the answer is yes, then the next question is whether the nature of the route or alternative routes is dangerous for the child if accompanied. If the answer is yes, then normally there will be a case for free transport. If the answer is no, then the question is whether it is reasonably practicable for the child to be accompanied. If the answer is no, then normally there would be a case for free transport. Consequently, Section 509, together with the various legal rulings, must now be considered by local education authorities in defining their policies on the provision of school transport and in considering the eligibility of the individual pupils for free transport. The DirectGov website, and I mention the DirectGov website because it is encouraged to be the website where many pupils and parents and families will turn to for views on policy, national policy, states on its home to school transport page, safe walking routes are those which usually include road crossings, good lighting and well-maintained pavements and footpaths. Local authorities are required to assess the suitability of walking routes. Having set out the national policy background, I'm now going to turn to my own local issue. Leicestershire County Council's view on the DirectGov website, as I've just mentioned, is stated to me in a letter dated the 20th of July 2011 from the Assistant Director of Transport. And he says, and I quote, "Safe is a very absolute term, and it is not possible to guarantee that anything is absolutely safe. So it is an unreasonable stipulation. The law requires that a walking route be available for a child accompanied as necessary by a responsible adult, and it is this criterion that we apply. But actually, as I've already mentioned, a route also has to be reasonably safe, and therefore the dangers of a particular route should be taken into account." In February 2011, a Leicestershire County Council scrutiny review panel reported to the Council's Cabinet on the Council's home-to-school transport policy. The panel was asked to consider, firstly, how available walking routes are assessed and the appropriateness of the current method of assessment, and then the issue of what is called in Leicestershire historic exceptions, and whether these services are still justified. Historic exceptions are routes where bus services are provided free to children, despite the route length being under the statutory distance, and despite the route having subsequently been assessed as available for children to walk. I should point out that children using those services on those historic exception routes continue to receive free transport at the moment until September 2012. The Salby to Barrow route in my constituency is not an historic exception. Yes, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I thank my honourable friend and neighbour for calling this debate, which is also a major issue in my constituency of North West Leicestershire. Does my honourable friend agree with me that under current guidelines, common sense can sometimes appear to go out of the window? In my constituency, I've had instances of older children retaining free bus passes when younger children in the same household are being asked to walk to school. And does my honourable friend appreciate how frustrating it can be when one house in the street has been judged to be just outside the 3-mile limit and gets free bus travel, and the next door neighbour is just within it and their children are being asked to walk to school? Surely we need a degree of discretion and common sense in these cases.
Thank you very much. I entirely agree with my honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. I think common sense has been lost as part of this debate and a part of reviewing these routes. And I've got exactly the same situation in Mount Sorrel, where apparently older children already at the Humphrey Perkins School are going to continue to receive free bus passes, and younger children starting at the school are not. So in undertaking the review by the scrutiny panel, they were asked to have regard to the financial, environmental and health implications of any proposed changes to existing policies in the context of the legal obligations placed on the County Council. And the overall review was conducted as part of the Council's medium-term financial strategy. The scrutiny review panel, as I've mentioned, did not consider the Salby to Barrow route, and nobody with an interest in that route, such as the headmaster, the families, or the local councillors, was asked to give evidence to that panel. And in reaching its conclusions, and I think here this is where common sense has gone out of the window, the panel decided that the width of a footpath and the lighting of a route did not need to be considered when a route is assessed. In May 2011, parents of pupils in Salby and Mount Sorrel, due to start at Humphrey Perkins School in September last year, were written to and told that free school transport would be available for their child. So imagine their surprise, and that of the head teacher of Humphrey Perkins, who also knew nothing about this, when in late June last year, they and the families of children already receiving free transport because the route was currently deemed to be unavailable, received a letter to say that actually that would no longer be the case. And because they live less than 3 miles from the school and there would now be an available walking route, they would not be eligible for free transport and instead would have to pay for a school bus service. It was at this point that a campaign group was formed and I was made aware of the problems faced by the 53 parents in Salby. Of course.
Honourable Lady on achieving this debate today. We have many problems in Dorset and I'd just briefly like to share some similarities. I consider the age factor as vital in as far as a 13-year-old will not wish to be accompanied. It's not a matter of the availability of somebody to accompany. And down a rural lane with fast traffic going down it, I think that's incredibly unsafe. And also I hope she'll be expanding on this point, that actually notifying parents at the last possible moment, notifying parents halfway through a sixth form course when a choice has been made on previous information, this surely is unacceptable.
like to thank the Honourable Lady very much indeed, my friend, for her points. I entirely agree with her. I congratulate her also on putting down the EDM on this topic, which I know has been signed by a number of Honourable members from across the House. And I think she's absolutely right. The safety of the routes has not been considered, but also it's the manner in which notifications have been sent out, which I find, as the local member of Parliament, being one of the most frustrating points. And I will mention that as well. So as I say, the campaign group was formed in Salby, and to cut a long story short, the council shortly afterwards admitted that insufficient notice of the change had been given, so the decision to withdraw the transport was postponed for a term. And I was promised that a new assessment of the route would be conducted once the clocks had gone back in the autumn. Why do we all consider the route to be dangerous? Well, the Honourable Lady just mentioned some of the dangers of these routes, but in Salby to Barrow, much of the route only has one footpath on one side of the road, meaning the child returning from school and adults have their back to oncoming traffic. The footpath is narrow. There are several pinch points where everyone has to walk in single file, and we're talking about 11-year-old children here, not messing about on their way to and from school. The speed limit along the road is 40 miles per hour. This is regularly exceeded. There are industrial estates along the road. There is a deep ditch. There's a conveyor belt for a nearby quarry, and the road is also so narrow at points that if two large vehicles pass each other, the wing mirrors overhang into the footpath at head height. Alas, the promise of waiting for the next assessment to be conducted after British summertime ended, and before any further decisions were taken, was not to be fulfilled. And parents received further letters in October last year to say that as the necessary cutting back of vegetation had now happened along the walking route, the free bus service would no longer be offered to them from this month. Meanwhile, despite my urging the County Council to work with the school to examine alternative services, no contact was made with the headmaster between July and late October 2011. The Council has since then had contact with the school about an alternative service, but that would be at almost double the cost of the service now procured by the headmaster. The Council has also indicated that when the school becomes an academy, home-to-school transport will no longer be their concern, and so this is something I hope the Minister can address. On a practical level, the position today, on the second day of term, is that the service for children living less than 3 miles from the school has been withdrawn, and some will now be using the train to get from Salby to Barrow. I expect others will be driven to school, increasing congestion, and some will walk that route. And that walking route, which some children will have to use, remains, in my opinion, highly dangerous, and therefore not available, as the legislation requires, because even an accompanied child cannot walk along it with reasonable safety. But the real question for us, as a national legislature, is whether the national legislation and guidance reflects the realities of modern Britain, or is the safety of our children at risk where a route can be deemed to be available when it is clearly unsafe? Of course.
Nicky Patel.
On securing this debate. Does she agree with me that she's touched on the whole point of safety and the safety of our children going to school, but also in the case of children with special educational needs in particular, where parents are deeply worried? I have the case of Melanie Green, whose 7-year-old son Aaron Green is given no support in going to school, and I'd welcome the Minister to look at this case actually. But in modern Britain today, with the changing needs of our children, this is one area that has to be thoroughly looked at and considered, and local authorities in particular must pay more attention to this area.
Nicky Morgan.
Well, I entirely agree with the Honourable Lady. I'm sure the Minister has heard and will hear representations about the particular case. But I think she's absolutely right that the needs, it goes back to the common sense approach, the needs of the individual families, whether it's the parents or pupils. We also have the case of parents with disabilities who cannot accompany their children to school because they just don't have the physical ability to do so, and yet somehow they are deemed to be able to accompany their children. So the Honourable Lady's actually right. This is obviously a huge issue for many Honourable members across the House, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to allow Honourable members to express their frustrations and views today. Yes, of course.
George Freeman.
Honourable Lady for giving way. I congratulate her on raising this. Would she agree with me that at the heart of this is, again, this issue of one size not fitting all and legislation not working in rural areas as it does in urban? Many of us will know that in cities of a morning, happy gangs of school children walking and cycling safely to work. In rural areas of a rush hour to commute, more and more families, families where both couples working, cost of fuel, higher speed of traffic, much more traffic on rural roads, and many of our schools in mid-Norfolk, more than 2 or 3 miles away from a local school. Actually, rush hour in rural areas to school is a real problem. This is the tip of the iceberg. Norfolk now provides 24,000 free journeys a day, and they describe that as the tip of the iceberg. Across rural areas, this is a problem, and I'd urge the Minister to see whether there's something we can do to review the criteria to take account of that important change over the last 40 years.
Nicky Morgan.
Well, I thank the honourable member very much, my own friend, very much indeed, and he's absolutely right. I mean, this obviously is a concern for parents, I'm sure, across the country, but he's absolutely right that rural areas are particularly badly hit. And my particular example involves obviously 2 villages, and the route between them is very much as a rural route, unlit. But he's right, and I'm going to come on and talk about working hours as well, and I'm sure the Minister has taken his comments on board. As I mentioned at the start, the test for the County Council is that a route is available if it's a route which a child, as company as necessary, can walk with reasonable safety to school. Now, we've talked about the reasonable safety point, and in view of the time, I won't labour that, but I do want to talk about the point that the child is going to be accompanied. Because assuming that children will be accompanied is surely to ignore the reality of much of family life, where many parents now work, and how the school day interacts with the working day. To walk 3 or more miles to a school will take a grown adult at least 45 minutes. When I walked the Sarby to Barrow route with the head teacher, the local PCSO, a parent, the leader of the County Council and the local councillors, it took us over an hour. And we had no children with us. So the policy assumes that the relevant adult has between 3 and 4 hours spare walking time a day to accompany the child. Clearly totally unachievable. My example in Leicester is not isolated. The campaign for better transport has revealed 38% of councils are reviewing or cutting transport to faith schools and 46% reviewing or cutting transport to schools other than faith schools. I fully understand the need to make savings in light of the appalling economic legacy left to us by the previous government and the tough choices this means for our local authorities. But there are some changes in services that have potentially devastating consequences. So in conclusion, I'd like to ask the Minister to address the following points. Firstly, could he update the Chamber on the progress made on the Department's review of efficiency and practice in the procurement, planning and provision of school transport across England? Depending on the stage reached, could the issue of how the safety of travelling children is being assessed by councils be considered by the review team? Secondly, could he, perhaps in conjunction with the Department for Community and Local Government, consider whether there is scope for the issuing of advice or guidance on how local authorities should handle decision-making around the withdrawal of transport services? In particular, I think there should be advanced consultation requirements, minimum notice periods, and an obligation on local authorities to work with schools and colleges in relation to the provision of alternative services before those services are withdrawn or fundamentally changed. Third, could he please confirm what the position is of those schools which become academies? Does conversion mean that an LEA is relieved of all of its obligations in relation to homeschool transport? And finally, would the Minister, perhaps as part of his consideration of the responses to the review previously mentioned, consider whether the time has come for a clearer statutory test about when a route is available or not? In particular, has the time come that the assumption that children will be accompanied should be dropped, and should it not be the case that child safety must be considered above all other factors when considering if a walking route is now available? Mr Chairman, I'm grateful to everyone who is here today for their attention and support, and I look forward to hearing from the Minister.